let me talk a little bit about this particular issue. I'm actually, this is the second time I talk about refugees in front of a large audience. The last time was at the AA meetings in December. And let me just point out again, I look around the room, and I actually might be the only person in the room who's a refugee. But, in my historical experience, my own personal history, and I'm actually in this data set at one point, which I'll show you. So I come at this both from a professional point of view, but it's something that's actually interested me a long time since I actually lived this experience when I was a little kid. And let me see if I get this right. Let me start with the Cuban refugee issue and present the graph after that. All of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Mariel experience in Miami back in 1980. It was very difficult for Cubans to leave Cuba for a long time. And that created political problems for Castro. And every once in a while, he'd sort of open up the doors and like a safety valve and release people and let them go to the US or sometimes Spain or some Latin American countries. And on April 20th, 1980, Castro decided for whatever reason that it was time to open up the safety valve and let some people go. And the conditions under which he said that release are sort of interesting. He said anybody who wants to leave Cuba can leave as long as you leave through the port of Mariel, which is not that far from Havana, but not that close either, and somebody comes to pick you up. So that created a rush among Cuban Americans in the US to try to go to the port of Mariel, renting boats and creating a boat lift. And within 3 days, April 23rd, the very first Marielitos had arrived in Florida. And then by June 3rd, or 6 weeks later, over 100,000 Cubans had made the trip. So this is quite a remarkable, what we call a supply shock. Within basically 6 weeks, Miami's workforce had grown by around 8%. Okay? So this is a very interesting sort of phenomenon that does not happen very, very often, even though it's happening more and more these days, as all of you know, within the European context. But at that point, this was sort of a very unusual kind of event. All right, let me show you the data. And this is the number of Cuban immigrants admitted to the US by year. Now, this data doesn't actually exist anywhere, so I had to basically make it up from many, many different sources and combine and splice to be able to create that time series, but it's probably not that far from the truth, okay, given what we know. As I said before, I'm actually part of this data set. If you look before 1959, when Castro took power in Cuba, Cuban migration to the US was not that big a deal. Comes 1959, and you can see 1960, 61, 62, the 62 data point, which is right there, I am a person there, okay? And then within a week after I left Cuba in mid-October 62. The day before I left, by pure coincidence, President Kennedy was told that Cuba had obtained Soviet missiles. And thereby began the Cuban Missile Crisis. And within a week, that safety route that Cubans had, and which I had taken part of, to escape Cuba, was closed down. And you can see the closing down almost immediate after that. And it was very, very hard for Cubans to leave right after the missile crisis for a few years. And then safety, other routes opened up, and then you can see the ebbs and flows in the flow, right? And again, you can get to the late 70s. It was very hard to leave Cuba. Castro makes that speech. The Mariel flow happens. It stops right away. And, it's been pretty much an upward trend with a blip in '94, which, for those of you who know the history of the literature in the immigration academic studies, that's actually another data point. There's a paper about that as well. But in any case, I'm going to focus today on what happened as a result of this, which is a very, very unusual event. Now, David Card, in 1990, published a classic paper that looked at the impact of that particular flow, the Mariel flow on Miami's labor market. And that paper is a landmark study, both because of its inherent interest, but also because it was one of the very first papers that basically looked at a natural experiment, something that just happened randomly, to try to estimate the impact of something that we all care about. Okay, what happens to the labor market when the labor market is suddenly invaded by over 100,000 people? Okay, by 8%, the labor supply increases by 8%. And what David, and I'll skip the last paragraph for a minute, I'll return to that in a minute. This is what David Card found. Now, this graph is not in David Card's paper, okay? I basically took data from one of his tables and graphed it myself. But you can visually see what his conclusion was, which is that not really much happened, okay? If you look at he looked at the trend in Miami as a result of the Mariel. Mariel is right here in 1980. And obviously, to be able to say Mariel had an impact or not, you have to compare that trend to what happened someplace else. In other words, it's a natural experiment. Think of it as a medical experiment. Miami is being injected with a particular dosage of something, and you want to get a placebo to compare Miami to whatever happened when you don't get injected with that, right? And he chose a set of placebo cities, which I'll discuss in a minute, to compare Miami to. And as you can see, if you actually do the numbers, it's like a dime, 10 cents, in terms of what happened before and what happened afterwards, which over a 40-hour work week, it's like $4 a week, which is basically trivial, which means nothing much happened. Now, the placebo is interesting. So let me do the placebo, which is that last paragraph. And I'm quoting straight out of David Card's paper, that entire quote. What he tried to do was basically compare cities that were similar to Miami in terms of employment growth. Okay, so basically, let's look at cities that are like Miami and see what happens to Miami when only Miami is injected with this particular supply shock. But if you read the quote carefully, you will notice that there's actually something wrong with the selection of the placebo. A true medical placebo would look at people who were the same prior to being injected, right? Well, he actually chose cities that were the same even after they were injected. Because don't forget, the supply shock happened in 1980. So what you want to do is compare cities that were the same before 1980. But he actually went through 1984. And he compared cities so that on average, they were the same both before and after Mariel. Okay? So that tells you there's something a little off about this right away. Maybe it doesn't matter at all, but maybe it does matter. Okay, so let me go on and tell you that despite David Card's findings, the people in Miami somehow reacted, okay? Within a month after the Mariel boat lift began, there were very violent racial riots in Miami. Those riots left 18 people dead and 400 people injured. Now, I do not want to say or claim in any way that those riots were the direct result of Mariel. There were many, many other factors that led up to the riots. And the triggering factor, in fact, had nothing to do with Mariel. The triggering factor had to do with police misconduct, okay? Which is something you hear in the US all the time regarding certain policemen or police persons apprehending other people who then something happens to, violence occurs or whatever, right? The same thing was true back then. But if you look at every single history of those riots, every single history will lay part of the events that led to the riots into the Cuban influx. And I just put a quote there, sort of showing you how Black Americans, how African Americans in Miami felt about the Cuban influx. There was a lot of resentment, and it showed up very soon after Mariel. Okay, it is very difficult to go back now in time to 1980, which is 36 years ago, and get really good data on this, okay? So what I'm going to do is show you today is the data that we have. Unfortunately, we cannot go back in time and do a survey contemporaneously. So this is data we have. And the data we have, it's a lot of numbers here, but I'll just tell you what it says. Look at the very first column, okay? This is what fraction of the Mariel people were high school dropouts. And what you can see is that no matter which data set you use, there is a very strong indication that a big chunk of the Marielitos were high school dropouts, people with less than 2 years of schooling. You know, something like 60% if you take the average, okay? Or something like that. And compared to Miami, that's actually quite unusual, because Miami was only 26% high school dropout at the time. So in other words, one would think that if one wanted to get the impact of the Mariel flow on the labor market, the group to look at is really high school dropouts. Because, you know, almost 60% of the Marielitos were high school dropouts, right? That's not what David Carr did. What David Carr did was to look at the Miami labor market for the most part. And that's the graph I showed you earlier. So last summer, in June, I was working on this book that'll be coming out in the fall. It's called We Wanted Workers, Unraveling the Immigration Narrative. I'm plugging it right here. It's on Amazon.com for pre-order if you want to order it. And $26.95. And this book is coming. I was working on this book, and I had some people read early drafts of the book, and some of the comments they made me think, and this is last June, made me think maybe it's time for me to revisit Mariel and just apply what I know about measuring this thing, the labor market impact, you know, and just return and see what happens. And I literally get up one morning and go to my office in my house downstairs, a Sunday morning. And I actually do this, I did this in Madrid the other day. I actually get on my computer and start looking at the data. And within an hour, I was getting a graph that was very, very, very different from what the graph David Carr got was. And this is how this paper came about. Okay, it's a result of this book. And let me show you, let me show you there it is. There's the graph. I'll return to the other slides. Okay? Let me show you what the graph looks like. So I'm going to look only at men who are high school dropouts, who are in their prime age, 25 to 59. Okay, now 25 to 59 means that they already finished school and it's prior to retirement. Now, ideally, I would want to look at men who are natives in Miami. Unfortunately, as I was saying, we don't really have the data going that far back. This is the CPS March data, which I'll talk about in a minute. And at that time, this current population survey did not tell you where people were born. So the closest we can get to the native population in Miami is by looking at non-Hispanics. Almost like over 3/4 of the immigrants in Miami at the time were Hispanic immigrants, in particular Cubans. So if you wanted to look at natives, you want to look at non-Hispanics. And this is the graph that you will get for the Miami wage, okay? If you look at non-Hispanic men aged 25 to 59. And believe me, you have to do no manipulations to the data whatsoever to get this. You can literally grind out this kind of graph by just selecting that sample. Male, non-Hispanic, in their prime age. And again, you want to compare that to something, right? And this is the Carr placebo, the red line there. These are the cities that Carr picked, okay, that were like Miami, between 76 and 80, right? And you can see that something clearly happened. Now, that placebo, as I pointed out, is not quite right, because it looked at conditions even after Mariel to pick the cities, right? So let me return now to the other possibilities, and this is the data. This is actually employment growth for all workers in the cities that the CPS identifies. The CPS at the time only identified 44 cities, Miami being one of them. And Miami, by that standard of employment growth, between 76 and 79, was actually doing very, very well. Employment grew by 15% in that period in Miami. It ranked number 6, in fact, across all cities. The cities that David Carr picked, by the way, happened to be Tampa, Houston, Atlanta, and LA, and they were all doing much worse than Miami, as you can see, before Mariel. Okay? And that's why you sort of get, it might not be quite comparable. So you might say, well, maybe what I did was to say, let me pick cities that are just like Miami to take the placebo, right? And I'm going to pick the cities that are right above it, okay, which are Anaheim and Rochester, and they're right below it, Nassau and San Jose. And those cities have basically the same employment growth prior to Mariel. I'm going to call that the employment placebo, okay? Because those cities were, just before Mariel, they were growing at exactly the same rate. And what you see when you do that is that the employment placebo was actually pretty flat, making the impact of Mariel look even bigger. Okay? And then one last thing you can do if you want to play around some more with econometrics. And by the way, once you start playing around, it's no longer a 5-minute exercise, obviously, right? You got to do a lot more econometrics. You can use a new methodology that Alberto Abadi, a colleague of mine at Harvard, developed, which is let the data decide which cities to pick. And what you do is to say, what I did was to say, let the data decide which cities before Mariel in that period had the same employment growth for all workers, had the same employment growth for high school dropouts, and had the same wage growth for high school dropouts. And this is sort of mysterious mechanism in statistics that if you say, let the data decide according to these 3 criteria, the data comes back, and you come up with this graph, which is what I call the synthetic placebo. It doesn't really matter, as you can see. I mean, what happened in Miami was so unusual, it turns out, for male non-Hispanic high school dropouts, prime age, that it doesn't matter which control group you pick. And the best way to see that is by looking at this graph. So, and again, this is just raw data. I'm not doing much fancy econometrics here, okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the 4-year period prior to Miami, prior to 1980. So you look at 76, 77, 78, 79. You look at the 6-year period after 1980, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86. What is the wage change after minus before? By what percentage did the wage go up or down for every one of the 44 cities? And just, calculate those numbers. And this is what the graph looks like, okay? So this, this is the distribution of wage changes. One more graph back. This is a distribution of wage changes across all 44 cities, before and after 1980. And what you can see is that Mariel was pretty exceptional. It's actually in the 0th percentile. In other words, no other city of the 44 cities that the CPS data allow you to identify had the same wage drop for the sample I picked as Miami did. You can actually do even better. Because what you can do is suppose that you do every single permutation of a 4-year pre-effect and a 6-year post-effect for every city and every year between 76 and 2003. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Take a city like St. Louis. Nothing happened in St. Louis in 1993, right? Let's act as if it did. So let's look at the 4-year period in St. Louis for 1993. Let's look at the 6-year period in St. Louis after 1993 and see what happened. Let's do that for every city, for every year, over the entire last quarter of the 20th century. Where does Mariel then stand? And as you can see, Mariel is all the way to the left, meaning it's actually in the 2.8 percentile. It was one of the biggest drops in wages across all possible city-year permutations that you can consider. Okay? So something happened. And if you look back at the main graph, it is not a trivial something. If you look at the wage drop, it's like 20, 30% easily. Now, Miami increased the supply of the supply of workers by 8%. but it increases the supply of high school dropouts by 20%. So we're talking about elasticity, if you want to talk about economic jargon, an elasticity of -1. And depending on the way you look at it, between -0.5 and -1.5 elasticities. These are way, way bigger than what people usually think of as being the wage effect of immigration. Okay? All right. Let me now, one more thing I want to point out before I go to the next graph. This is what happened to high school dropouts, right? Across all these city-year permutations. One possible counter-argument would be, well, maybe Miami was just really, awful during the 80s. Something was happening in Miami to everybody. So let's look at high school graduates. What happened to high school graduates? In other words, the group of people just above high school dropouts. That didn't happen to high school graduates. Very few Marielitos are high school graduates. So whatever happened in Miami was targeted at a very specific group of low-skilled workers. Okay? Now, let me return to the main graph and point out two really big puzzles that we don't know the answer to. One big puzzle is, why did it take so long for the effect to show up? Okay? If you consider neoclassical, traditional labor demand theory, the way we teach it in class, one would think the shock happens today, and tomorrow morning you'll see a huge wage drop. That's not what happened. Now, the problem with that is that the way we teach the labor demand framework tends to ignore a lot of things about the way we do other things in economics. The easiest way to see it is the following. Think of the fiscal crisis back in 2007, 2006. Would any macroeconomist expect the bad effects from the fiscal crisis to happen immediately? In fact, there are all these lags, right? Wages are sticky, and it takes time for things to go and to the labor market. So in terms of macro models, this is not unusual at all, except we've never done that in the immigration literature. So that's one major puzzle. We have to figure out and have a better way of thinking about the dynamics of how labor markets respond to supply shocks. We just don't know. The second thing that's interesting, which is sort of strange, is that the wage recovered. And again, a purely neoclassical model of labor demand would say, it shouldn't recover. There should still be distributional effects. The Mariel people were really, really low skill, and that should have a pretty permanent impact on the low skill labor market, unless something responded on the side. And in this, it could well be that many of the low skilled workers in Miami left. That could well be. We don't know if that's true or not. The data for that is really hard to manipulate. But I'll tell you something else that's sort of unusual, which doesn't fit with the way we think about things. When we look at stuff like this, we tend to think about real-world effects of what really goes on the ground. And there are two real-world things going on in Miami at the time that really can contaminate a lot of the stuff. One real-world thing is the drug trade. Remember Miami Vice? Well, this is the period of Miami Vice. It's the late 80s, okay? And the flow of drug money into Miami at the time, which I think, even though I had never anything to do with the trade, I would think employs a lot of low-skilled workers, could really affect the labor market. The second thing that goes on is those riots I mentioned earlier. Those riots basically induce the flow of huge amount of federal money into Miami. And again, that's something that our models don't consider. And that clearly may have something to do with the recovery. But we just don't know. All right, let me make sure I don't run out of time. I'm going to skip regressions. I mentioned these already. I will skip that. No, I will not skip that. This is what I'm going to do. And then I'll get to 10 more minutes? Yeah, thanks. Perfect. I'll get to the end, okay? I was saying before that, we have to pick a placebo, right? To see what happened. And I tried to indicate that it didn't really matter which placebo I could pick. Well, this is actually the best way to show that. This is what I'm going to do. In 1980, okay, I'm going to look at the years before 1980, 77, 78, 79, the year after 1980, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86. And I'm going to compare Miami to every conceivable four-city placebo. In other words, remember Card picked 4 cities, LA, Tampa, Atlanta, and Houston, okay? Well, if you think about it, the CPS has 44 cities, right? One of which is Miami. How many 4-city placebos can you make out of the other 43? You can actually make out 123,410 such placebos. I'm going to estimate the before and after weight change 123,410 times and see where the data actually falls. And this is the impact with the employment placebo, the synthetic placebo, and the CARB placebo. Okay? The CARB placebo tends to sort of minimize the effect. The employment placebo tends to sort of like maximize the effect. But a really nice thing about this graph is that no matter which placebo you pick, the wage effect is between minus 0.4 and minus 0.1. Okay? In other words, given the data we have, you can pick whatever control group you want. And as long as you stick to the sample of male, non-Hispanic, prime age, men in Miami at the time, and you compare it to anything else that was going on in the US, you're going to get a pretty sizable wage impact with a mean of around minus 0.2. And minus 0.2 is basically, don't forget, an elasticity of minus 1, basically, because it's a 20% supply increase for high school dropouts. Okay? So all this, now let me return to David Card's paper. David Card's paper is really a great paper. I mean, you know, I've taught it in every single class on immigration that I've ever done in my life since 1990, since it came out. And it's one of those classic papers. And here I am 25 years later, and in one summer morning, a Sunday morning in my home, in my pajamas, really, literally, I get this strange graph. So I begin to wonder what in the world is going on. Okay, there's something really fundamentally off with the way we used to think about Mariel. Okay? And what is going on is that if you look at this sample, you know, a lot of stuff we thought was true needs to be rethought. Now, needless to say, when you make claims like that, it creates a disturbance in the force. Okay? And within a few months, within 3 months, after my paper was released as a National Bureau of Research working paper, let me be more precise about that. I first came up with that graph back in June of last year. Many people read the paper or read many drafts of this paper in June, July, and August. I wrote a paper right away just to make sure that I had it down, okay? And I had a lot of comments from people I know over the next 3 months. In September, I released as a Bureau working paper. By December, 2 people had already created written comments regarding my paper, trying to restore order in the galaxy in some sense, okay? And 2 criticisms come up. One is that the wage impact doesn't show up immediately. They claim that if you only look at 81, 82, nothing happened. My answer to that would be, so what? Nobody would expect the demand shock in macroeconomics to have the impact the day after the demand shock. I mean, our ignorance doesn't really mean that nothing happened. It's just that we've never, as a labor economist, we've never bothered to think about the dynamics of wage impacts of immigration. We've been way too much worried trying to measure the impact in the first place, much less worried about, you know, how this thing will evolve over time. And if you talk to any macroeconomist, the idea that all these things should show up the morning after, they would find it completely ridiculous. The one interesting thing you can do in this data, by the way, is that don't forget this is 1980. This is the year where Carter and Reagan were running for election, right? Inflation rates were really, really, really high in the US at the time, period of very high inflation. If wages are really sticky, all that you have to do as an employer to let the market adjust is not raise the nominal wage. And maybe that's really what's going on here, okay? The second issue that people have raised in the criticism is that my sample that I picked is the wrong sample. which is because it's too small. And in my paper, I put all the facts right out. The sample of native, I shouldn't say native, the sample of non-Hispanic men aged 25 to 59, in the March CPS is only about 20 people a year. In the CPS ORG, which is the other CPS sample I use, it's around 60 people a year. That is why I try to always pull the data. That is why I was saying, let's look at the people, this, 76, 77, 78, 79, pull 4 years, and then pull 5 or 6 years after that. So you have to pull. And despite the small samples, I didn't show you the regression result. A lot of the stuff was very, very significant. Okay? So they claim to make a bigger sample, we should expand beyond male non-Hispanics. Now, once you expand the sample, you're going to get different answers. Okay? And then the question becomes, whom would you believe? And this is 2 graphs. Okay? So you can sort of see how manipulating the data can lead to very different answers. This is my graph. Okay? Except I did it here for the rest of the country. The curtain A is male non-Hispanic high school dropouts, age 25 to 59. This is the graph in a paper, well, they don't have this graph actually, but replicated it, in a paper by Perry and Yasanov, which is all non-Cuban high school dropouts, age 16 to 61. Okay? There are, even though they claim that the control group matters, that's actually a completely irrelevant issue. I've shown you that no matter which control group you pick, you're going to get something, as long as you stick to this sample. The control group is really a red herring, it's completely irrelevant. What really matters is who do you want to look at, okay? And the question becomes, which of these 2 things is more sensible? And let me tell you my argument for why the curtain number 1, my graph, is more sensible. First of all, I look at males, and they look at men and women. It is extremely unusual in labor economics, in the wage structure literature, to consider a pool sample of men and women. I mean, that's something we just don't do. If you look at the classic studies in the wage structure literature, Katz, Murphy, Lemieux, and so on, it's either men or men done separately and women done separately. One really big problem with pooling men and women in this data, okay, is that don't forget, at that time, women's labor force participation was very intermittent. It was growing very rapidly, in fact. Between 70 and 90, participation rates for women were growing from like 40 to 60%. Well, that means that the sample composition is changing over time, right? Because as you go over time, there are more women in the sample. More women are working. Well, you don't really want sample changes to drive the results. And that's what you get when you add women. So that's one reason for sticking to men. Now, it may well be that you might want to do women separately, but then you have to worry about the selection bias. And to worry about selection bias, for the economists in the audience would know full well, you need all kinds of fancy statistical techniques that would raise even more questions as to whether you can believe it or not. Okay? So that's one problem with doing women. What about Hispanic versus non-Cuban? Well, there's nothing wrong with adding Hispanics. I mean, with adding I look at non-Hispanic, I look at non-Cuban. There's nothing wrong with adding Hispanics, except for a minor little detail that, again, if you're on the ground, you realize it's not quite right to do that. And what's not quite right to do that is that the 1980s were a period of huge Hispanic immigration into the US. That's when the illegal population began to increase dramatically from Mexico. So that means that a lot of the Hispanics you're adding into the sample are immigrants who arrived after Mariel. In fact, I won't show you the table, but in fact, 40% of the people that you add to the sample by doing this minor little change are immigrants who arrived after Mariel. Well, that's not quite right. Okay? And then finally, the age composition. I picked 25 to 59 because I wanted people who were not in school and not near retirement. They do 16 to 61. Well, this is a way of showing how it is very hard. I mean, one of the things of my book that's coming out in September, $26.95, Amazon.com, one of the things of that book is that you really have to look at the nuts and bolts of how people do things to be able to whether you can believe it or not. Because a lot of the stuff people do is sitting in footnotes. And this is one of those things people do that, seems completely trivial, right? What difference would it make? But it's not, okay? And let me tell you why it's not. When you look between 25 to 16, when you do that, that means you're adding 16, 17, 18-year-old kids into your sample. Now, the CPS data doesn't tell you if people are in school or not. But if you're in the US, you know full well that most people 16, 17, 18-year-old are high school students. The way you define a high school dropout is, do you have a high school degree or not? That means that if I have a 16, 17-year-old kid in high school, they'd be considered high school dropouts because they don't have a high school diploma. Well, that's not really what you mean by high school dropouts. And 40% of the increasing sample when you do that are kids who are in high school, who have nothing to do with high school dropouts. And again, that can't be right. So I look at this and I just see a lot of obfuscation of what the real result is. Something happened in Miami, and if you look at the sample of low-skilled workers, 2559 men, it's undoubted, there's just no doubt that something happened. That is the data, okay? Let me conclude by sort of saying, I just said the first point, something happened in Miami, and an important lesson, going back to David Cart's paper. You look at the entire Miami labor market, you don't see anything. You look at the people most likely to be affected, you see something. It is really important to look at the people being affected to be able to decipher what the wage impact is. You write placebo. One last thing I want to point out, which is also relevant in terms of the current situation in Europe. Economists know full well that the gains from immigration are the flip side of the distributional impact. That means that if the Mariel experience is really right, if what I show you, if that graph is really right, the gains from immigration are actually much bigger than we think they are. Because, that lower wage led to much bigger gains elsewhere. So if that graph could be applied to the entire labor market, we really have to at least triple what we think the gains from immigration are. So from my perspective, people see this sort of study and see it as sort of a not favorable argument in terms of immigration. I see it as being a very favorable argument for immigration, actually. Because it's telling you that the gains could be huge. But that doesn't mean that everybody gains. It means that the people who lose an awful lot. And that's going to be true whether it's in Miami in 1980 or whether it's in Germany today. There are going to be labor market impacts from these shocks. And the cost will be huge, and the gain will be huge as well. Okay, thank you very much.